Welcome to part one of my videos about the Lanshan tent. This first one is about how to pitch the tent. The second one is about the modifications that I've made to improve it a bit. Let's get started. So the Lanshan is a very popular choice for backpacking, especially for people who are already using trekking poles. It's light and it's very affordable. I've had my Lanshan now for over a year and I've used it for nearly 50 wild camping nights, including along the Cape Wrath Trail, on moorland, mountaintops and campsites. So all kinds of terrain, and these tips are about my personal lessons that I've learned over those different camping scenarios. So these aren't official tips, these are just my personal recommendations based on my own experience. But they've certainly made a big difference to how I've been able to use the tent in different kind of conditions and how well it's been pitched in different kinds of terrain. So check it out, and also check out the modifications. You'll see some of them whilst we're talking about the pitch. I'll talk to them in a separate video about the different improvements that I think can make all the difference to how you use the Lanshan. Five things that I'm looking for when I look for where to pitch my tent: level, flat, well drained, sheltered, and ideally with a water source close by. So if you manage to get 5 out of 5, that is Nirvana. Doesn't happen very often. The next job is to look for a space that's large enough, and the Lanshan uses quite a lot of space. You're going to need something that's about 2.5 meters squared, and then you've got the pegging out points as well. So one thing about the Lanshan compared to other lightweight tents is it does use quite a large footprint, and that does mean sometimes you have to compromise on where you can pitch. The next thing I'm going to do is check the wind direction, because that makes a big difference to the orientation of the tent relative to the wind. Right, so I now know which wind direction I've got to contend with, so I'm going to be facing the tent so that the vestibule is facing into the wind. I'll show you more what that means when I've got the tent pitched. Let's get the tent out and start pitching. Okay, so I've got the tent spread out now, and let's show you how I've done it. So what I've done is to lay the tent out into a perfect rectangle. Now you'll see that I've got the footprint permanently attached, but even if you don't, the bathtub must be in a good rectangle on the ground before you get started. Now if I'm camping wild, what I also try and do is make sure that the inner is kept away from the rain, so it's tucked neatly underneath the fly if I'm pitching it all in one. So here I've got it roughly laid out into a rectangular shape, and having that rectangle is crucial to the quality of the pitch later on. Okay, so I've got the corners pegged out now, and I want to show you how it's done. So the pegs are pulling out the corner tensioners at a slight angle, and if you look at the angle I've got it at, that tensioner is pointing pretty much towards the opposite corner of the rectangle. So it's a good starting point. Have the tensioning black strap pointing towards the opposite corner. Now I haven't got the corner tensions very tight at all, it's quite a lot of slack, and that's important for when I put the poles in. But I have made sure that all of the guidelines I'm using are fully slacked off to the maximum, so there's loads of options for tightening it up. So there we are, corners pegged out. Next step is to put the poles in. And the first thing I've done is to set my poles at a good starting length. Now, these are black diamond poles, but all poles have a graduated length down this length of the shaft to help you set it at the right length. Usually they're in 3 sections. And to start off with today, I've got mine set at 120, and that is the difference between the top of the handle, which is where the tent will be resting, and the bottom of the tip of the pole. Now this ground I'm using here today is a nice lawn, and when I put the pole in, it's not going to dig in very far. But if it was very boggy ground that the tip would sink into a lot further, then I'd need to compensate for that on the length that I set for the pole. Okay, so what we need to do now is find the inside of the tent, and at the point where the pole goes there's this loop here, and if it's windy and raining this will take ages and also faffing out and fiddling, but it's very important to have the top of the pole sitting inside that loop, otherwise it'll slip around, cause you all kinds of problems. So the tip of the pole, I place it into that loop, and I tend to hold it there with one hand whilst I pull the tent over the top, and then lift the pole and the tent into position. So the position that you want for the base of the pole is to be fairly central on the bathtub or the footprint or whatever, and level with it, so it's not pushing the in or out, pretty much so that the line of the bathtub and the footprint can be straight. I'm just going to rest it there. Chances are I'm going to want to nudge it and move it around a bit in a few minutes time. Now I'm going to move around and do the other pole. Right, that's both poles in. Next thing to do is the main guy lines. Now in the modifications video we'll talk a bit about this arrangement that I've made. It's slightly different to how the tent arrives from the factory. Well, I've got the guy lines pegged out now, and you can see that I personally have extremely long May guy lines, and I got them coming down to a delta peg there. These are about 3 meters long, and I've got the same at the other end as well. So I haven't put much tension on the lines yet, but already you can see that the side of the tent is sitting a lot flatter and the ridges are straighter. Now basically the longer the guy lines are, then the direction of pull from the main guy lines is more horizontal, and so you get a much better pitch. So the next job is to tension these up, and as I tension it I'm going to be making sure that the ridge line of the tent is as flat and straight as possible. Right, so the main guy lines have been tensioned up now, and the ridge line is much better, nice and level and straight. If I come round, you can see it, and this makes the world of difference to the pitch. Now you can also see that I've gone to a lot of trouble to make sure that the guy line is pretty much directly in line with the ridge. If it's putting at a slight angle, that's going to give you problems, especially in windy conditions with your poles moving and slipping around, and the same with the other one. Guy line straight as possible in with the main ridge. Now notice that now I've tensioned up the main guy lines, the side of the tent is already very flat and smooth with no creases. What I do is to get the side flat and the ridge tensioned first, and then peg out the vestibule. Now I mentioned before that I got these pegging out points diagonal, slightly offset, so the line of the tensioner is pretty much in line with the opposite side of the tent, or you might say have it in line with the opposite point of the ridge. Now this is where I differ from the factory. When you look on the Lanshan factory guidelines, they say to point the tension points at 90 degrees to the base of the tent. Now that will lead to decreasing. I'll show you. Right, so if I have this tensioner more at 90 degrees to the base of the tent, there's not so much tension being applied across this side wall, and it's a lot more flappy, saggy, and a lot more slack in it. So that's already going to give us a problem with how the tent is tensioned. So that's why I prefer to have these pegging out points angled slightly, so not there, perhaps turned around a bit. Okay, so I've repositioned the pegs to a direction that I'm happy with. Next job is to peg out the vestibules. Now, you'll find that you use one door more than another just because of the arrangement with the lining up of the inner door of the tent. It's more likely to be this side that gets opened and shut more than the other. So a quick tip, when you're pegging out the inner, have the bungee for the right hand side above the one for the left. That way you won't have to unhook the left when you go to unhook the right. Okay, so I'm just going to put those in. and then we'll do the same on the other side. Okay, so the vestibules are pegged out now, and you can see that already the sides of the tent are flat and smooth with very little creasing, and that's before I've done any minor adjustments to the tension of the pegging out points. The base of the tent is sitting level, and there's even clearance around all the sides, and that's really useful for reducing any elements of condensation. Right, now we need to look at the separation between the inner and the outer before we do anything else. Now you can see at the top I've got a healthy gap there between the ridge of the inner and the ridge of the outer. And you can also see as we come down to the side that there's a lot of slack in the inner and the outer as well, and that can lead to sort of the inner billowing around and potentially making contact with the outer, and that's when you get problems with the inner becoming wet. So I've checked the ridge line's okay. Now I'm going to make sure that the separation on the sides between the inner and the outer is good. Right, and that's where these side guy lines come in. I've extended my side guy lines to make them much longer than the ones that come from the factory. These are about 2.5 meters at maximum, I think, perhaps something like that anyway, and I'm going to peg them as far out as I can. Now I had lots of space this side. Unfortunately the other side there's a flower bed, so it's going to be a bit shorter, but the main thing is to have them as far out as possible. The other important thing is not to over tension these side guy lines. It's really important. If I apply too much tension, this happens, and we get those sharp V creases on the side of the tent, and the ridge sags. If I let go, you can see this ridge is level again and we lose the creases. So do not apply too much tension to the side guy lines. Okay, so the tent is basically set up, and now we come to finessing. Now this might take a couple of minutes, but it's well worth it. Remember, you're going to be sticking in this tent for hours in potentially bad conditions, so time spent now improving the pitch will make the world of difference. First thing I want to talk about is the pegs. So the pegs that come with the Lanshan are these. They're fairly small in cross section and they're not too long, but they're perfectly okay for things like the side guy lines. For the main pegging out points, the four corners and the vestibules, I use slightly larger pegs. We can have a heated discussion about what weight and size specification of pegs is the best for you. It will depend on the terrain. One thing I always do, despite the weight penalty, for the main guy lines is to use delta ground anchors. Now these weigh a little bit each, and they do negate some of the weight gain from having a nice lightweight tent, but the strength of the main guy lines is crucial to the security of the tent and the quality of the pitch, so it's well worth it. And these are fantastic because they will dig in really bad ground, and the more tensions that applied, they kind of dig themselves in. I've never had a problem with it at all. I might occasionally rest a boulder on the top just for peace of mind, but it really doesn't need it. For the vestibules, I just use one peg. If it's very windy, I might double peg it. So my normal setup would be to have 6 standard pegs, 2 smaller ones for the pegging out points on the side, and 2 delta pegs. But I always carry a couple of extra pegs just to be on the safe side in case one gets bent or lost, or I want to have 2 double pegged on the vestibule. Right, so everything's set up nicely, and the last thing I would do if I was pitched in the wild would be to go around and just cinch up all the tension points like this, just to make sure that I'm happy that I've got absolutely no creases on the side. So as you can see, a few creases here. I'm just going to cinch up the corner point to make sure that those are eliminated. Right, that's got rid of those. Okay, so if I'm happy with the positioning of all my pegs and the tension, the last thing I'm going to do is go in and make sure that all the pegs are properly deep in the ground. So I'm going to just push them all in so that there's perhaps just a centimetre or 2 exposed to stop the guy lines pulling off. Right, tent's up. Let's have a look at the inner. Great thing about the Lanshan is the amount of interior space. This is well over 1 metre wide and nearly 2 metres long inside. So there's acres of space and there's a nice big wide ridgeline as well. So I find for long trips or in the winter, it's a fantastic amount of space, even for solo camping. Now on both the inner and the outer, there are tie-back points when the doors are rolled out of the way. But there's an interesting feature that not many people have registered, in that there are tie-back points on both sides, and on the inner, even on the side when there isn't a door, there is a lug. So we can use this lug to attach it to this tie-up point to give more tension to the inside of the tent. Okay, so now I've attached those. These points here, halfway up the corners, are nicely extended, so I'm getting a lot more space inside the tent. Right, so I've now extended the poles to 125 centimetres, and remember that because the ground's quite hard here, I'm getting an extra 5 centimetres because the tip just isn't digging into the ground at all. If you're on more sort of rough and soggy ground, that would be digging in more. So we've got 125 plus 5, if you like, 130, and the side of the tent is nice and flat now, and there's much more tension down the corners. Problem is with these tension out points, they're sewn on the factory a bit too high, so I've got quite a loose lower half and a tight bottom half. If they were set just a little bit lower, then the tension would be much more even. But this is certainly, I think, the maximum height that you would set for your poles. And that's giving me a really good amount of clearance underneath the bottom edge of the fly to allow for ventilation and anti-condensation. Okay, so we set the tent up for nice benign conditions with no problems with wind and rain, particularly in warm weather or whatever. Well, we want a nice gap around the bottom edge of the tent to prevent condensation build up and give us lots of nice fresh air. But what do we do when it's not going to be such a good night and we want to hunker down and sit the tent lower onto the ground? So let's experiment with that now and shorten the poles to about 115, see what happens. So with the tent poles set at 125 and a bit of extra clearance because it's hard ground, the clearance at the bottom edge of the tent is about the same as a tent peg's worth. Right, so I've shortened the poles to 115 now, so they're 10 centimetres shorter. Let's see what a difference it's made. The clearance now under the edge of the ground of the fly is about half a peg, so shall we say 7 or 8 centimetres. So I've got the tent much squatter into the ground. I'm going to get much less of a breeze blowing through. Now what I sometimes do, if it's going to be windy, if for example the wind is coming from this direction from the right, then I might set the right pole down at 115 and set the left pole up at 125 so that I still get the benefits of the ventilation, but I've got a bit more protection on the windward side of the tent, and that's perfectly okay to do with the Lanshan. It gives you that amount of flexibility. But there is a problem with having the tent set this low. So with the tent set low and the normal bungees on the door, we get a problem where the fly sort isn't in a straight line anymore on that zip line. It points out towards, or pokes out towards the bottom, and we get some very strange alignment on the pull-out point and tensions on the fly sheet. So what I've done with my pegging out points is to give me some adjustability. Okay, so what I've done now is shorten the bungees that are putting the door down. I've basically halved them in length, and that now means that the zip line is much straighter and the whole tent is sitting happy. Right, so just out of interest, I've now shortened the poles to 110. So if I was camped on a mountaintop or in a very exposed position, what difference does this make to keep the tent lower to the ground? So tent poles set at 110, and this is the kind of gap that we get. This is really hunkered down low now. Okay, so with the tent poles set at 110, if we go inside, you can see that the top of the inner is still relatively tight because I've clipped it to the peg out points or clip out points here. But the problem with the bagginess of the lower half of the inner is obviously more pronounced because it's not extended so much. So that's my Lanshan pitched. Absolutely flat surfaces, no creases. Let's look at some of the problems that you'll see in photographs or might experience yourself and address what's causing them. Right, this is the most common thing that people encounter. We've got a very pronounced U shape on the ridgeline and some spectacularly big V creases on the fly sheet as well. And it's a frequently asked question of how to eliminate this problem with the valley in the ridge. So why is it a problem? Well, if we look inside, I'll show you. Okay, so with the problem pitch, if you can see at the top, the inner is in contact with the outer. They are touching, so there's going to be massive leakage issues and risks there, as well as flapping and noisy nights. So if you're experiencing this problem with a U-shaped ridge and bad creasing on the fly, there are 3 steps to cure it. The first step is to slacken off these side guy lines. So take out all the tension from them and make them nice and loose. The second step is to tension up the main guy lines so that the ridge is as straight and flat as possible. It may be that you need to add a bit of extra tension to the corner tension points. And when you've done those things, you could apply a small amount of tension to the side guy lines. Once you've done that, you should end up with a ridgeline that's nice and straight and level, and no V creases on the side panels. And most importantly of all, I've now got really good separation between the inner and the outer. Right, so just for fun and out of interest, I'm going to pitch the tent now, see how long it takes from scratch to fully pitched. Now, joking aside, I'm not going to race. I've not got a point to prove. I'm just curious to know how long it's going to take. So I'm just going to carry on at my normal pace. Try not to hurry too much. So, 3, 2, 1, go. Right. Oh, 4.5 minutes. Get in. Right, 4.5 minutes, that's not too bad. I did have a problem with the alignment of one of the poles. I had to readjust it before I did the main guy line, and one of the lower pegs had pulled out of it as well. So I think that was quite an authentic challenge. So let's say comfortably within 5 minutes, if you're attaching the inner and the outer together, you can get the Lanshan pitched. Right, so those are my suggestions for how to pitch the Lanshan tent. Hope you found something in there that'll work for you and you find useful. You might have spotted in passing some of the modifications I've made to my tent. If you wanted to find out more about those, then look at the modifications video. I use the tent quite a lot in Dartmoor and Brecon Beacons, and I'll try and post some more videos of those. And there's also quite a long video of my trip on the Cape Bath Trail earlier this year when I used the tent. So subscribe to the channel and check out those. In the meantime, see you later.